Hello, my name is Ron Dorn, and this is a presentation for GCU 113 about landmark policies. This presentation in particular is about America's public lands as an example of a series of landmark policies that have led to policies around the world. So it's landmark not just in the United States, but there's global impact. The presentation objectives or the takeaways are that America's public lands all originated as indigenous lands, where USA policies negatively impacted indigenous peoples. That public lands were created within the context of complex historical movements and mindsets, and that a common mindset now is that these lands are being protected for future generations. Lastly, please educate those around you about America's public lands. It's important to pass on your understanding. I start with a map, nativeland.canada, showing the language groups of indigenous origins in North America. You'll notice that there were extensive areas, really the entire continent, inhabited by indigenous peoples. Language groups are then grouped regionally into what you see here by anthropologists. For indigenous peoples, land history begins with time immemorial, with different origin narratives, some indicating that people rose from the center of the earth, like the Hopi, or that people hatched from eggs. For archaeologists, human occupation started well before the last ice age, at least 36,000 years ago. Earlier and earlier sites are being discovered in each decade. The pre-Columbian, just before Columbus arrived, population estimates are uncertain, but the map on the right shows different regions of the Americas with high and low estimates of how many people were occupying a region prior to Columbus. With the Columbian and other European invasions, explorations, whatever you want to call them, there was indigenous genocide, disease, smallpox, uncertain pathogens, salmonella, and at least 12 epidemics that are often called kukulitsi led to population collapse that you can see here. How many deaths occurred from smallpox and from a number of other epidemics in just a short period of time? Just horrific collapse and decline. In addition to disease, there was slavery. A motivation in European exploration was enslavement of indigenous people to work in mines and plantations. They were removed from ancestral lands and put to work for the acquisition of precious metals and other commodities. So after the genocides, after broken treaties, relocation, the government land office was formed to survey and dispose of U.S. government land and created a structure that distinguishes public lands from private lands, including land occupied by indigenous people. The GLO administered the Preemption Act and the Homestead Act, and the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803 prompted President Thomas Jefferson to launch the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore lands occupied by indigenous peoples. So there was a period of assimilation and relocation, and this Indian removal period began in earnest in 1830 when President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This act called for the removal of indigenous peoples, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, Seminole, Cherokee people, from their ancestral lands, mostly in southern states, in exchange for lands that would become parts of Oklahoma. And the journey became as known as the Trail of Tears, where over 4,000 of an example of 15,000 indigenous people died in such relocations. Then in 1851, the Indian Appropriations Act moved Western Native American tribes onto reservations. And the Dawes Act was another legislative action in 1883 that sought to assimilate indigenous peoples into European society by taking the children away from their families and sent to schools and forbidden to speak their indigenous language to convert them to Christianity. So here you can see obtaining more and more territory by force and treaties led to the current geographic extent of the United States that was then supplemented tremendously when Andrew Johnson signed the Alaska Purchase with Russia in 1867 for just 7.2 million. And then even more indigenous peoples were impacted by this land acquisition. So now let's jump to the 21st century and examine the federal lands and their use in the United States in the 21st century. Just examine this pie chart. Here's another map to just examine. Land administered by a variety of different U.S. land agencies. It's impressive. A lot in the eastern U.S. and most of it in the western United States. There's an important point here called the tragedy of the commons. The idea is if you have land that's used by many different people, the use of common land, and if it's not regulated by users themselves or by the government agency, the land can be overused and degraded to the point that it can no longer support that use. The Dust Bowl is an example where you had a tremendous amount of soil erosion from wind because of over abuse of the land. So when you administer federal lands, decisions are made that are never the best for all because there are multiple stakeholders. For example, in Idaho, you can look at the tan roadless areas where roads can now be constructed. The brown are roadless areas where roads cannot be built. And the black areas are those recommended for wilderness in various forest plans. So everybody who wants to use these lands in Idaho can be upset either by their use to construct new roads or in removing them from road use. Another example of this ongoing, how do you administer federal lands and the tragedy of the commons is the Clinton administration's attempt to resolve management conflict in Northwest National Forest. So they have this report to the President and Congress, tried to implement a forest plan that would make everybody happy, development, forestation, timber use, conservation use, and nobody was happy. So here's an example of the sort of email and discussions that happen, an example of the political tussle in Congress and the public over land management. Everybody paints the other side, either the users or the protectors, as evil. So let's take a look at the biggest agencies of those that manage federal land: the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior. Let's look at the Forest Service. Here's an example of a chart, flow chart of federal land management agencies and where the Forest Service rests in relationship to the president and the executive branch. So you have the Secretary of Agriculture, and under that, the Forest Service that administers a variety of different programs. So the mission of the Forest Service is currently to sustain health, diversity, productivity of the nation's forest and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations, with guidelines being the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, NEPA, that established the EPA, and the National Forest Management Act. But the Forest Service has really been around since the late 19th century. And there have been a series of legislation and individuals, powerful individuals like Gifford Pinchot, that became the chief of Division of Forestry in 1898, and the Weeks Act that authorized additions to the Forest Service by purchase of private lands, and then the ecosystem management policy under the first Bush administration. So it's an amazing amount of management issues in the National Forest System: fire protection, logging, mining, protecting watersheds, protecting wildlife, and then recreational use. So here's kind of another flow chart on everything that happens in the Forest Service and how land management policies impacts everybody's interests. The National Park Service under the Department of Interior. Yellowstone was the first national park, and then came Yosemite, and then came historic sites, and then came the Wilderness Act. So there are a lot of stories in the National Park Service about how each park was added. Yosemite started as a California state park, and then the Lincoln got involved, and then Hetchatchee Reservoir or water supply in San Francisco, and the big earthquake and fire of San Francisco got involved. And eventually, in 1916, Yosemite National Park was established with all of this prior issue and prior history for an amazing piece of land. So let's look at the symbol of the National Park Service. Have you ever wondered about the arrowhead you see and what it means when you enter a national park? Each part of the emblem symbolizes something that the NPS was created to protect: human culture, trees, special plants, land formations or scenery and recreational opportunities, wildlife, air and water. The National Park Service was officially founded with Yellowstone in 1916 to protect all of this. For example, Joshua Tree National Monument was created in 1936 that then became a national park in 1994. It would be easy to go on with everybody's favorite national park, but let's go to Fish and Wildlife Service, with a very long history of legislation resulting in the importance of the 1973, under the Nixon administration, Endangered Species Act. So it's important to understand that endangered species are viewed by a Republican administration and a Democratic Congress as important enough to impact land management policies to protect a species from becoming extinct. All of these species, along with hundreds of others, are currently endangered. We save endangered species in this act through bipartisan legislation because plants and animals hold medicinal, agricultural, ecological, commercial, and aesthetic value. So endangered species are to be protected so future generations can experience their value and their presence. So here's some supplemental legislation to protect bald eagles, marine mammals, especially in Antarctica. You got to save the penguins. So, like other legislation impacting federal lands, it's always evolved. And Congress went from pro-development to pro-conservation, and then pieces of it are now back to pro-development. The Bureau of Land Management, the yellow, administers a huge amount of Western U.S. land. It started with the GLO, or the General Land Office, that administered the Homestead Act and the Railroad Act and the Mining Act and the Desert Land Act and the Taylor Grazing Act. And eventually, just after World War II, the BLM itself brought a lot of separate agencies together to administer a lot of land. But in the 1960s, pushed on by bipartisan legislation, the BLM, when it was established, held hundreds of public meetings to determine which lands should be retained or disposed of. And it was really an amazing set of events in the late 1960s to involve the public in decisions of land management. And the Bureau of Land Management is dedicated by legislation and purpose to promote multiple use. And it means the management of public lands and their resources to be used in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. So the BLM develops resource management plans to look for public involvement, to create overarching directions, and to deal with the balance between uses and protection. So what guides multiple use? People are concerned about wild horses. Drilling for oil is a concern for many people that like less expensive gas. I'm a mountain biker. This is me and my wife and a guide in Monument Valley. That's my concern. Thompson Creek is an example of multiple use, open to grazing, close to oil and gas, extensive management for recreation, open to off-road vehicles and mountain bikes in different areas. It's really up to the individual location and then the individual BLM office to establish these resource compliance. But overall, there has to be guidance to meet a slew of federal legislation. If you look at all the different laws that guide BLM policy decisions, it's mind-boggling. Just take a look at this list, pause the presentation, and wow. If you're in charge of a BLM office, what you have to do for statutory guidance to maintain your policies are consistent with this federal law is really amazing. There are legacy pieces to the United States public land policies. All of this legislation you've seen rolled out too quickly in this presentation. There's really the birth of a conservation movement associated with public land policies, starting in very early with David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then leading to Theodore Roosevelt's use of public lands for hunting, growing conservation movements associated with hunting around the turn of the 20th century, and then moving on towards, finally, the recognition of indigenous legal status for these lands, including also several new land designations to recognize the struggle for civil rights. And again, pause the presentation and you can look at this growing list. One of the concluding thoughts is that the United States, in this hodgepodge of legislation over a period of the history of the country, led the way in public land with the goal of protection. Even though there's a tremendous amount of use involved in public lands, there is the protection component that actually led to national and international parks and public lands around the world. So the United States policies led to the United Nations recognizing 6 categories of public lands: national park, manage resource protected agencies, habitat species management areas, strict nature reserves, landscapes and seascapes, and national monuments. In summary, I really think that the total package of federal public land legislation is one of the great landmark pieces of public policy law that you'll encounter globally. I hope you enjoy the public lands and educate others about what you know.